Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, in the case of some of you. Today we are hosting the last of our urban design conversation series. You know by now that we set up this series in order to collectively reflect on some pressing tasks and challenges that urban design is facing. Also in light of current events, we are in a changing world, and somehow practice and scholarship and research must cope with the fast pace of change in order to reinvent themselves constantly. As you know, we contacted a series of alumni. Today we have with us Melissa Garcia-Lamarca, Laura Michner, and Cristiano Robertson, respectively, if I'm not wrong, from 2008, 2009, 2009, 10, and in the case of Christian, 2014, 15, if I'm correct. I shared with you yesterday their backgrounds, but I will give them the word in a second to have a short introduction of themselves before getting into the presentations that they prepare for us. The topic of the panel today is housing justice, and I asked to the speakers a question that is, what are the conditions of possibility for the current practice to have agency toward a just housing production? The question is intentionally broad, as broad and also very diverse has been the activity of our guests today. You saw from their bios that they had a multiplicity of experiences throughout their personal career path, but also that at the same time they worked in very different realms. So I really look forward to listen to their contribution. But first of all, I would like to give the word first to Melissa, then to Laura and to Christian for a very short personal introduction. Thank you. Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Giorgio, for having this session today. I'm Melissa, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher based at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, which is at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And I work on questions around housing justice and around urban green inequalities. I did my PhD in Manchester, at the University of Manchester in geography. And as Giorgio said, I was an alumni from the BUD program in 2008, 2009. Thanks.
Laura?
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. So I'm based in New York. I work for a nonprofit in New York doing affordable housing development. I've been there for just over 6 years. So we develop housing in New York, but also in 5 other states. And before that, I was working in London in a community-based homeless charity. So sort of been in the housing and homelessness world, but on the practical side, not the academic side, for a while, and was at BUD. And before that, did something totally different, English literature in New York.
Thanks, Laura. Christian?
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm Cristiano Robertson. I'm based in Santiago de Chile. Well, I'm an independent practitioner. I'm researcher and teacher, all mixed up. But I'm interested in urban vulnerabilities from different edges and in the understanding of housing as an urban project. So I'm super happy to be here with you guys, and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks to all of you. It's very important that we reiterate many times that the fact that we thank you for your time. This is extremely valuable, and in the current condition for many of us of home working, etc., it becomes even more appreciated. For 2 of you, is especially for Laura, is especially early in the morning, so double or triple thanks. Now, without further ado, I will let Melissa start, and I would ask all the audience to, if there is any clarification question that are very welcomed, of course, to perhaps write it in the chat while the speaker is talking or immediately after. The presentations will last for about 15 minutes, and we will allocate, in case if it's needed, about 5 minutes after each presentation to address these possible questions of yours. At the end, we aim to have a collective discussion that I will loosely facilitate. In that case, we welcome any sort of question and comment, of course, reflection from you, and the speakers will try to address your concerns and to respond to your inputs. In that case, if you are bold enough to open your mics and cams to ask the questions, that is going to be appreciated. So we try to have this discussion in a bit of a less impersonal way. Thank you so much. Melissa. Can you share your screen, Melissa?
I'm not going to share any
that's fine. That is perfect.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks again, everyone, for being here. And I wanted to speak to this question that Giorgio posed us about the conditions of possibility for practice to have agency towards just housing production from my experience as a housing and urban political ecology and economy researcher, as well as a housing activist in Barcelona. So my reflections will come from this context, but I would also like to try to decenter this and think beyond the global north context, because I know this is important for our work collectively. So what I wanted to do is I want to be a bit provocative and center my intervention around one main point, which is to move towards housing justice. I propose that we need to both challenge and disrupt the current socio-political housing production system that dominates in most of the world. So in the current system we are in, the vast majority of housing production is deeply embedded in speculative, financialized development that reaps huge profits for few and ultimately produces completely insufficient or no housing solutions for the poorest, racialized, or otherwise marginalized residents. So I'm going to talk in the next 10, 15 minutes about why I think this is necessary and how it can happen, focusing on the role that housing justice movements can play. And also I want to comment about the role of academic production or engagement based on my experience. So I think to begin with, I think it's not a surprise for any of us to hear that there's a lack of social, public, or at least affordable housing in virtually all cities around the world. And the mainstream solution from governments, from the financial sector, and of course the real estate sector is we just need to build more, right? This is often what we hear. And I think the main problem with this solution, so-called solution, is the political economic context that we live in. Urban production in cities is intimately linked to speculative financialized urban production of all types. So housing, public spaces, commercial spaces follow this kind of logic. So we know that housing is a universal basic need, but it's important to underline how housing operates as an object of investment and an item of speculation. So on the one hand, we know that a home fulfills a basic need, a psychological, emotional need, as a place of security and stability in people's day-to-day life. But on the other hand, it's a commodity with an almost unique ability to spur economic growth and returns on investment at multiple levels. So of course, a lot of capital is required to build housing, and in the private sector, which builds most housing around the world and in most cities today, capital is attracted by speculative possibilities of profit. Housing also needs a lot of infrastructure to support it. So roads, energy, water supplies, sidewalks, all sorts of other infrastructures, which feeds private and public construction. And households purchase or rent homes and fill them with objects, which stimulates consumption, investment, and credit. And of course, if you purchase a home, you require a mortgage, home loans, and from mortgage credit, which is what I've looked a lot at in my research, there's investor demand for securitized financial vehicles, for example, residential-backed mortgage securities or rental-backed securities, which is a new product, which are sold on secondary markets. And this is a huge factor that drove, in the case of residential-backed mortgage securities, the 2008 financial crisis in the US, Spain, and Ireland, and many other countries. So if we take all these factors together, it means that when housing booms, the economy booms. And so also it's important, I think you're very aware that housing production is cyclical. So there's booms where production increases significantly, and then there's a bust where production falls significantly. In the context of Spain and in many other places, the production of public housing in particular is often counter-cyclical. So in the Spanish context, production of public housing occurs during economic downturns, because during a housing boom, the profit margins are so high that developers don't want to build public housing because they would rather build market housing because there's so much more profit to be made. So I think what is really fundamental here as planners, architects, activists, researchers is rethinking what we mean by housing production. So I see two key dimensions here. First, I think questioning this idea of housing shortage, because I think the problem in many contexts is not that there's not enough housing, but it's the fact that most housing being produced is unaffordable and inaccessible for the most marginalized groups. So what I said at the beginning, for example, I think we have to think about the type of productive model that exists, which stands in opposition to just housing solutions. And I look forward to listen to Laura and to Christian to hear how they're working on this through participatory housing production and these kind of other types of models. The second point I think that's important if we're thinking about rethinking housing production, particularly in a lot of the global north, is the number of empty homes and homes owned by financial entities. So in Spain, the 2011 census, which is the last data that we have on this, there were 3.4 million empty houses across the country, which is a legacy of the housing boom from 1997 to 2007. So about 500,000 of these 3.4 million housing units became the property of banks during the economic crisis. Although technically, since these banks were bailed out with 63 billion euros in Spanish and European taxpayer funds, these housing units should be public, which is part of the struggle of the housing movement I'm going to talk about shortly. So and I think this kind of political dynamic and this reality is where housing and social movement struggles for transformation and just housing solutions can come into play, in how they both can challenge and disrupt this the dominant housing production system. And they can challenge existing relations of rent, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So in Spain, the housing movement, the Platform for Mortgage Affected People, the Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, the PA, has been trying to do exactly this, to challenge these relations of rent and in some ways challenge this production of housing, the model that it exists. And they do this through a dual strategy. On the one hand, they challenge legal frameworks to stop evictions, cancel mortgage debt, and to overall create a more just housing system. On the other hand, they enact solutions themselves. So they block evictions, occupy banks to get mortgage debt forgiveness, and occupy empty housing owned by financial entities with and for families that have no housing solution. So these direct actions, particularly occupying empty bank-owned housing, challenge the dominant housing production system by directly attacking the social relations of rent. What do I mean by this? So specifically, occupying housing politicizes the contradiction between the socialization of private sector losses through bank bailouts. So the fact that our society has rescued banks and the financial sector with public funds, and then there's been a privatization of subsequent profit. So it brings this reality into the public sphere and makes it visible. It also disrupts the financialized housing model and the new paths towards rent extraction by making these assets, what investors see as assets, but what are homes for people, they make them unavailable for speculators. And finally, these actions shift the current distribution of the current and future distribution of rent away from capital towards people who make use value of housing. So they make a home of these empty housing units that are otherwise going to be speculated with. So before closing and leaving the floor to Laura and Christian, I just wanted to share briefly some thoughts on the role of academic engagement in more just housing production. In my experience, from getting deeply involved with the housing movement with the PA, which is not always easy or possible, which we can talk more about in the debate and discussion, and through my work understanding the lived realities of housing financialization, so the process of housing becoming a financial asset and what that means for people's lives, I was able to think more conceptually about processes that are very fundamental to the inhabitation and day-to-day life in relation to the broader political economy of housing and mortgage indebtedness in particular. So from this engagement and learning from and with the movement, I developed new ways of theorizing about these processes. For example, thinking about how when housing becomes a financial asset, people's lives become a financial asset. And so how this process of this abstract process of housing becoming a financial object deeply affects people's day-to-day life. I also have been thinking through these ideas of the social relations of rent with colleagues that were working on land grabbing in Ethiopia, and extractivism in Bolivia. And we propose this idea of value grabbing to show how value is already produced, in society, is appropriated and grabbed by rentiers through speculative financial process, which is a type of class struggle. So does this kind of academic thinking and research change the world? No, not in itself, of course. I really do think that what housing movements are doing is really critical in terms of providing real material solutions for people's day-to-day life, and also the applied practice that Laura and Christian are doing through stimulating these new kind of participatory production models. I think at the same time, research can make visible what was previously invisible, and which is, we know, important for policymaking and changing some things on an institutional level. New ways of theorizing, I think it's important to say, also have the possibility of changing ways of thinking and in turn acting, and also provides inspiration on what is possible when we think from but beyond the current system to more radical and egalitarian housing alternatives. I think a nice example of this, which maybe Laura knows, is a working paper that was written by the Urban Democracy Lab at New York University on creating a social housing development authority. So the aim of this social housing development authority would be to purchase distressed real estate, particularly multifamily rentals, and financing it to transfer to the social housing sector. So again, it's not about building more housing, but reallocating the housing that exists and thinking differently about housing production. I'd be happy to share this report with you and any other work you're interested that I brought up. And so finally, before closing, I wanted to mention the Radical Housing Journal, which is a journal that I'm part of the editorial collective. It's a peer-reviewed online international journal where we seek to explore housing as a practice in the making, as a space of contestation, and as a space of politics. Well, a lot of the mainstream housing research literature operates uncritically within existing housing production frameworks. We try to bring activist and academic spheres together to generate new types of knowledge production. So I'll invite you to check that out, and I'm happy to share that on the chat. So I'll close there. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. There is a very inspiring comment from the chat, thanking you. And for all the students and the audience, Marisol has just shared the link to Radical Housing Journal. I see a question from Maria Celia. Thank you, Maria Celia. Let me go through it. She wanted to ask you what examples of forms or organization in international solidarity you have witnessed around housing, and what can we learn from them for the way we approach housing tribulations in the present and future?
Thank you. This is a great question, very big question. Well, actually, I think with COVID, what's interesting that's happening with COVID, well, there's been renter strikes, tenant strikes across the world. There have been a lot of campaigns organized across Spain. And I think connected to the pandemic, there's been a lot of extended organizing from housing to food distribution to other kind of grassroots solidarity activities, which has been sparked by COVID, and in part also to break out of such strict confinement that we've been living in Spain we have pretty intense restrictions. So I think it's interesting to I want to comment that within the context of COVID, there are these new forms of organizing that are happening. I think what's difficult with, I mean, actually at the DPU, Adriana Allen and other colleagues are part of the Habitat International Coalition, which I think is a good example of international solidarity and organizing. And actually in the last issue of the Radical Housing Journal, there's a conversation between Adriana Camila, who's also a former BUD alumni, and another colleague they're working together on the Knowledge Action Project, the KNOW project, which is really great. That talks about the Habitat International Coalition. So you might want to take a look at that article to look at international forms of solidarity. I think there's so much to be learned. I think one of the big things for me that and then I want to leave the floor to Laura to move onward, and we can continue the discussion after, is I think the ways of organizing that the PA has developed in terms of collective assemblies, where people share their fears and they advise each other and share their knowledge and break the individualized experience of housing debt, being mortgage indebted, has been really fundamental in terms of transforming people's ways of seeing the world and feeling like you're alone, you have your own problem. But I think these collective processes that assemblies have in Spain, but in many other places, have a really huge potential in terms of how we think about housing and act on housing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. Thanks, Marisela, for asking the question. I'm actually pasting the link in the chat to the article Melissa just referred to in case you wanted to have a better look. The word now to Laura. And Laura, I think, if I remember correctly, you will share your screen. Is that correct?
I do have something, but I think I'm going to follow Melissa's lead and not share because I don't think it adds anything, actually.
It's okay. It's up to you.
Okay, so so the context that I'm coming at this from is I'm based in New York, and so what I'm about to speak about is very much New York centered and is surrounded, like is rooted in a place where there is no land to develop. There's housing. There's a very low vacancy rate. Affordability is a major problem, and so that's sort of the general context that I'm working in, and also only in affordable housing. So and only in rental housing. I also am concentrating on multifamily housing, so not home ownership or single family units. And for families, I do work a lot in supportive housing and for seniors, but right now I just wanted to concentrate on family housing. So when I received Giorgio's question, I was trying to think about sort of, what are the conditions that I would like, or we would like in New York to be able to create just housing. And I think that the question of itself sort of assumed that creating just housing has this implication of, housing that is good and right and fair and sort of open. And it almost seemed like that was too difficult of a question. So like right now in New York and in other places, I don't think it's unique. We're so far into a hole of housing inequity that we're only like, the only thing that we can hope for right now, and like in the immediate, is trying to aspire to just housing, like to try to create a space where we can like think about how we can achieve that, because any production that we have right now cannot sort of correct a wrong. It could only sort of try to get us to a place where we could correct a wrong in the future. And I just think that's important because I think you need to understand the sort of the reality of the huge disparities, especially in New York, where you have, one apartment will sell for $88 million, and then someone else will be moved into an apartment that, like doesn't have a sink. So sort of that's sort of the context that we're thinking of. And so when I was thinking of this, I was looking at it as, what is good housing and what's the purpose of housing? And for me, I was looking at it as the goal of housing is just a means to an end. Like it's for, I'm not talking about sort of the built environment and how the physical building can fit into a city and what it can do, but just for the individual that's in the space, it is only a means in order for that person to be happy and healthy. Like that's the purpose of housing. It's only to create the space that allows someone to sleep and to eat and to have friends over and to be able to exercise and to be able to have a space to do their homework. It's just a place where you can do all of the other things that you need in order to be happy and healthy. And so for our buildings and sort of for how this is achieved, there's the physical building, creating a space that is, has durable materials and good ventilation and efficient utilities and recreation space, so all of the things you need for good housing. But then also just like bringing it back to this very low bar of housing, it's also having places that are not, don't have a leak and mold and have heating that works. And so you are unable to have good housing and to have just housing when you have all of these things that don't allow you to be happy and healthy. And the second is that looking at the place outside of the building. So how that a building, how housing is connected to the city and how it's connected to the community. And the building in and of itself almost seems unimportant compared to its access to transportation and healthcare and schools and recreation spaces. And so in New York, I think that there's been there's an acceptance of the first thing. So there's an acceptance that you need good housing, that there's a value that's put on, and this I'm talking again only in the affordable housing world, but there's a value that's put on good quality housing, and it's backed up by money and time and energy. And I think that that's been pretty successful. And the second, I think not. I think the value of housing and where it is and how it's connected to the city has not been, is still a major problem. I think it brings this question about where housing is built and how it is built. And there's, the long debate about whether or not you build housing in neighborhoods that have sort of been traditionally neglected, and neighborhoods that have had a lot of the negative impacts from not only neglect, but also from like very active policy decisions for housing and infrastructure and environment, like particularly, before 1968 and 1964 for housing and environmental respectively. And do you build in these areas, but you have to build up all of the infrastructure? Or are you trying to find opportunity areas that are that have the infrastructure in place and that have the links to schools and hospitals and subways and all of the things that you need? And I think that in New York, there's this aspiration to build in opportunity areas, and then it's largely like immediately given up on. Like, it's not possible because land is too expensive, and it's just, they sort of assume that won't happen. And sort of these two options, they're both like incredibly daunting, because when you're trying to build housing, you either have to build up an entire infrastructure of schools and hospitals and all of the things, or you need to find land that, again, is impossible, that there is no land. There's no land that can be affordable for, building housing for homeless people is not as lucrative as building housing for in luxury developments, as Melissa was talking about. And so I think with both of these options being completely daunting and you want to do neither of them, the answer is obviously that you have to do both of them, because the demand is too large. But besides just the demand being too large, you also, it would be impossible to have just housing without having good quality housing and connected housing in all of the neighborhoods. You can't be just in one solution that you sort of everything is targeted. And this just made me think about, I have some projects that I was just going to share something quickly on. I have a project that's that's a 40-unit project, which is very small for New York. And it is connected to a lot of subways and to Prospect Park, which is a big park in Brooklyn in New York. And it's in a racially and economically diverse neighborhood. And the schools nearby are very good. And it has like this very unique opportunity to build housing. And it's exactly like the place you want to build affordable housing. And it makes no financial sense. It's like the worst project for every like zoning reason and for, issues with the land. And I find myself like clawing to try to to try to make this building happen, even though it doesn't make any sense. And then, because it will never happen again. Like, it's these opportunities to build in areas that have this connection to the city don't happen. And they don't happen because there's no land, but also there's not sort of real effort to prioritize them either. And then in contrast, I have another property developing that's 510 units in East New York, which is a neighborhood that is also in Brooklyn, but that's been traditionally had very much investment, has higher crime, and the school's performance isn't as high as other places. And so you then have to create this infrastructure. Like there's no park, so you need to create a park. There's not as much after school, so you have to create the after school, like all of the things you need to create along with it. And I think that there's like a value in both of them, but I almost feel like it can be an equal value in both of them. And just this third project I wanted to share was, there's another project also in Brooklyn. So all these places are not actually that far away from each other. And so when I was going to the sites, you know, saw renderings and it's like beautiful and it's lovely and there's urban gardening and, you know, a gym and everything that you want for a building and for a community. And I get off the subway and you're walking and you're walking and you're walking and you're walking and you're still walking. And you realize that when you get there, the only thing that this place has is land. That's all it is. It has nothing else that can create housing that is connected, that when an individual moves in there, they are able to sort of access all of the things that are outside of their individual space that allows them to, you know, be happy and healthy, to go to schools and have the after school programs and all of the things that are needed. It's just land. And it's just made me think a lot about sort of like why this is, because that site is going to have literally hundreds of millions of dollars invested in it. And so it doesn't matter often to the developer if it's there or if it's somewhere else, because it's, for them, the money that they'll receive is going to be the same. The work that it takes to develop the housing is going to be the same. The number of units on their portfolio is going to be the same. And so needs to be sort of a change in the mindset. And I think that right now the conditions exist that housing, and again, only talking about affordable housing, but housing for housing's sake is good. Any affordable housing is better than no affordable housing. And I think that, I can understand why people say that and why they think that and why all of the money and energy goes towards that. But it doesn't sort of help us like claw out of that hole of the lack of just housing. It just sort of creates more housing. And I think that there needs to be sort of a switch from the numbers of affordable housing units to the type of, in the place of affordable housing units. And sort of the conditions need to be created where this like new value is put on individual places connection to the city and to the community, but to like all of the infrastructure that allows people to sort of live as they would like to live. And I then started thinking about the ways of like local engagement and how this could work. And every point I said it couldn't work. So I'm gonna have to stop there because I have no other sort of solutions. But it's this shift I think that we need to have. And again, this is New York, but how we view housing, from creating housing for housing's sake and versus housing in specific places. That's it.
Thank you so much, Laura. Look, while you were talking, there were a couple of inputs from the audience. One was a comment that if Dina doesn't mind, I will leave for the following part, because it could be actually a good opening for our discussion. Dina was reflecting on the fact that the current circumstances are basically changing the way we experience housing in the everyday. And so new challenges and new, let's say, ends perhaps that we are searching for while we think of housing. And then Maria Celia was asking us a very specific question that it's on the activity of Help USA, Laura. And she was wondering how do you deal with designing housing when you have a certain level of uncertainty toward who will inhabit that housing, especially when we are talking of people coming from diverse contexts, different cultural backgrounds, and so on and so forth. There is also a second part to the question, but perhaps we can stick to this one meanwhile.
Yeah, so when we're designing housing, you don't know sort of who the end user is, who will ultimately live there, but you will know something about the population that will live there. So before you build the housing, there'll be requirements, and this sort of will go into lots of the ins and outs of state and local funding, but you'll know sort of the type of person of like a population set that will be living there. So the way that we develop housing for a family housing is going to be very different than how we would develop housing for a supportive population that would be, meaning like a chronically homeless population with mental health issues. So, I mean, it wouldn't just be the size of the units that would be different. You'd also, it's particularly the amenity spaces and how you, what you're trying to sort of promote if you're trying to get, create spaces that people can, leave their units and sort of like socialize, or if you want there to be a lot of space for different activities or support or health or, whatever it is, you sort of don't know that it's going to be one specific person, but you can know the general population, and then you sort of design accordingly.
Thank you, Laura. There was a second part to that question that perhaps we can still address since we are good with time. That was challenges of temporality. Somehow we are facing very uncertain conditions. There is an economic crisis happening and so on and so forth. The housing process, obviously, it's something that does not happen instantaneously. So I guess that possibly changing conditions might affect your process. So, and your work in the everyday. The real question of the specific question from Maria Celia, sorry, was is temporality a big challenge? How do you contribute to the strengthening or construction of communities when people's futures are so uncertain under the given conditions?
So I think that there's sort of two parts to this in my mind. One is there's something that's come up of a lot of debate within sort of my world of affordable housing development, which is how are you designing spaces for in sort of a COVID environment? And there's always this question of are you designing spaces for the current situation? Are you designing spaces for 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, and trying to sort of look into a crystal ball and trying to understand what's happening now is going to be sticking with us, and what happening now is going to be just non-existent in 4 years, 10 years, 15 years time. And so I think that it's trying to sort of pick out the things that we think will be sticking with us. I mean, there's a huge shift in how that, people who live in our buildings are living in our buildings, because even though the people in our buildings are probably not the supportive buildings, but the other ones would be more likely to be working in jobs in these like last 11 months that would need to require them to leave their apartments and not be able to sort of work from home because of the nature of the jobs. But still, even with that, there's still a lot of people, more people are in the building than ever before. And so trying to design, like, is that something that's going to be sticking around? Do we need to change our design in order to account for that? Or once in 5 years' time, are people going to be back at their jobs and it's not going to be a change at all? So I don't have an answer for that. It's more just, there's a lot of questions about, things like ventilation, where this is now saying, okay, now we should be focusing on ventilation. We should have always been focusing on ventilation, but now we're being forced to focus on ventilation. Whereas other things are like, do we need some sort of like special lighting that helps you show germs? And like, the answer is no, because that's not going to be relevant in the future. And for strengthening the communities, I think that there's sort of our projects and things in New York, they take so long. Every process is just an incredibly long period of time. I mean, one of that large development that I'm working on is, I'm hoping to close it in the end of this year, but I started talking about it when I got home from maternity leave and my daughter's 5. And it will be another 2 years before it's fully built. So you're talking about a 7-year process. So I think anything that in New York is just, the life cycle is such a long time that there's this sort of this, and this also might just be a New York mentality, but everything needs to move forward. There always is this push. So even if things are uncertain, it's like trying to find a way to find some certainty so that in 4 years' time, there's not a lack of housing because people were stalled now. At least that's how it's approached from my side.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you so much. There were no further questions at the moment. I'm sure there will be many more later. And I will move to Christian. I think, yeah, now it's perfect. And in your case, you need to, you're going to share your screen. Do you see the option?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we can enable it for you. Perfect. Great.
Let me know when you are seeing my screen.
Yeah, we can. Thanks, Christian.
Right. Well, again, thank you for an honor to be sharing with you after several years, again, here in DPU. During the presentation, I'll try to reflect through the review of a specific experience on the following question. What are the conditions of possibility for the current practice to have agency toward a just housing production? And as the other panelists commented, I want to start by setting the challenge that the understanding of housing, not as a house, I think the challenge is to understand housing as an urban project. So I'll share with you the experience of 9x18 laboratory promoting neighborhood regeneration on a human scale. And the laboratory is set inside the School of Architecture of the Universidad Católica in Chile. So the presentation is organized in 3 main sections. I will share with you the context in which we work. Then I will review the laboratory itself, and then the current projects and challenges that we are facing. So let's start with the context. This is somehow the tale of a piece of land, or many pieces actually. It's a piece of land that have 9 meters front wide and 18 meters of depth. Well, and now you get the name of the laboratory. It's not that. So by the half of the 20th century, cities throughout Latin America went through an explosive demographic growth due to massive rural-urban migration. And the new inhabitants settled on urban peripheries by occupying land and building informal settlements, as you see in the image. In a context of immense scarcity of public resources, the state faced this challenge through a known program called Site and Service Program. The program proposed that the land occupied were transferred to the neighbors, new landlords, and the layout of the neighborhood were delimited in regular lot size. Those lot size were about 9x18, it could be 10x20, or there are different lot size, but the interesting thing that the state delimitates in regular lot size. So then the neighbors themselves will organize to build their neighborhoods, their homes, and their surroundings through pure grassroots organization. And this program operated on a massive scale, as you might imagine. The image shows the site and service projects financed by the World Bank around the world. We have to remember that we were in the middle 50s, 60s, so we were in the middle of the Cold War. North American suburbs were being built independent on their context. Just see the, well, it's quite pixelated, no? But let's see the plan. This is a site and service program in Venezuela. Well, you have to imagine the plan. It's not that clear, but this is a site and service plan in Cambodia, in Thailand, sorry. And this is a site and service. So at the end, we were building those suburbs independent of their context. In the case of Santiago, the city where I live, in 5 years, the state delivered more than 70,000 sites, mostly on the periphery, where inexpensive or accessible land was. But the interesting thing that the horizontal expansion of the city as an oil stain produced that what 50 years ago was considered to be peripheral is now considered what we have called pericentral or pericenter. That is not in the periphery, it's not in the center, it's just in the middle. But the interesting thing that which after decades of urbanization and public investment, now this space are considered as an asset. It's a good urban land. Let's go back to our sites and let me show you what has happened from its first delimitation in the 50s to today. At the beginning, the occupation were done with tents and recycled buildings material, as you saw in the images at the beginning. In some cases, were built just the sanitation booth by the state. Gradually, the house will be built. Over time, the state will be urbanizing this neighborhood, also carrying equipment and services. By then, families and local population started growing, and thus the second wave of self-construction occupied mainly the first floor through the gradual aggregation of enclosure. We have to remember also that Chile, well, Latin America, and Chile in particular, we have the earthquake issues that, so it's impossible to build more than 2 floors in an informal way. So several generations have modified these sites, adapting housing solutions to their needs. And today, self-converts 90% of the sites. And therefore, there is no access to natural light, there is no ventilation, privacy, and there are increased fire risk, respiratory diseases, among others. Several researchers have shown up to 4 generations sharing the plot along with the owners, what we have called allegamiento. I'm not sure if there is a direct translation, but we can understand it as, so I'm not sure, but understood as a people that don't own the land, but are sharing the same plot of land with the owners, not necessarily by rent. Today, those neighborhoods, we can find inside the plots precarious conditions and overcrowding. In a way, a kind of hidden poverty. But in a consolidated built environment, well located and with a significant proportion of public space. Over the last 15 years, the extended household has grown by 2,040%. In a way, these neighborhoods have been retaining new generations that demand not only access to housing, but also access to the city, what Laura was commenting. And it is interesting, if you, well, it appears that my internet is not that good, so if I have any problem, I will change my
Christian, I noticed that sometimes your voice is slightly fragmented. Perhaps while you keep sharing the screen, you might want to switch off your video. Okay. It's up to you, whatever, if you think it can help. Yeah, thanks.
So it is interesting because 94% of the families declare that they like their location. And 82% don't want to move or change their borough. The families are preferring to live overcrowded but well located than in a new housing in the periphery. So we are working as a laboratory in a territory that is well integrated to the city and all its opportunities, services, public transport, access to social services, among others. But at the same time, those areas are facing several threats that should be a priority for the public interest. So within this urban context, what we promote through the laboratory are the following motions: to retain, not to evict, We want to develop intercity growth, not another city. We promote working with the neighbors, not for them. Social cohesion and collectively building new imaginaries and design a city-friendly housing solution. So let me briefly explain you who we are, how we work, and what we do. Well, we are a team in multiple disciplines and a quite multifunctional group as well. Always articulated with others, communities, different state departments, local governments, other universities, NGOs, trying to address the problem from various edges in an articulated and collaborative way, because we believe that this is the only way. What we do, we teach, we research, we develop, and we develop projects. And at the same time, we spread our ideas seeking to influence the public agenda. So let me just show you a quick overview. In the teaching pillar, we perform practical studies, postgraduate thesis, theoretical courses, always linked to real territories, real people, and their living experience. Seeking to awaken the interest of future professionals, and also seeking to awaken the interest of professionals linked to these issues at the global level. We are just launching an online course that we will run together with TUDEL for professionals around the globe. At the same time, we're constantly developing tools and methodologies appropriated to work in real territories. And well, at the end of the presentation, I'll share with you the link to download if you want to check them. On the research pillar, seeks to influence on public policies promoting urban approaches where the neighbors is in the middle. A good example of this is the study carried out in 2012 by the Professor Tapia. Today has become the basis for a social housing statal program. This year, we are developing several research related to those neighbors, imaginaries, and possible. The third pillar projects develop housing and urban public spaces and participatory methodologies, intending to make the theoretical approach a reality. Here is the case of one of our projects, which is the pilot that I mentioned a few slides ago. The project concentrates on building all the families co-living in the same sites and generates 3 independent departments promoting a collaborative and collective style of life. And we articulated it through participatory methodologies during the whole process. Also exploring morphological approaches of grouping and design, improving the current housing standards. This is how the proposals looks, and now we are in the building, in the construction phase. In 2018, we won the Inspiring Practice Award from UN Habitat. But the interesting thing of this that confirmed us that the focus of our projects address not only a local, but a global challenge. And last but not least, our fourth pillar, the outreach. We achieve nothing by generating content and learning if we keep them to ourselves. And for this reason, we organize seminars, workshops, we're writing books, papers, and participate actively in several seminars and events. We truly believe that through urban regeneration of those neighborhoods, with the people, we can build a good city, where the people in poverty do not have disconnected from the benefits of the rural life, the famous right to the city. We truly believe that a good city is at the end a just city. So this is the whole team. And for more information, you can check the following link. I will share it with you in the chat. And also, if you want to download the methodologies for working in vulnerable territories, you can scan the QR code, or I'll share you as well the. And finally, if you want to contact me or you have any question or wherever you need, there are all my contacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Very inspiring. We got a question. Meanwhile, I will read it. Building on the question that was asked to Melissa, what can we learn about the most recent way of collective habitat in Chile, namely social condominiums? How can we use this knowledge to build new ways of successful collective housing, taking into account the cultures of the collective?
Wow. Well, thank you, Maria. it's a great question. I'll try to answer it, but it's interesting because from 70s until 80s and 90s, and well, until today, the state built the social condominiums, not understanding the context where they are built. So we're still building houses, just houses in the periphery where the cheap land is. So I think one of the biggest challenge that the states are facing now is now that we have to return to the center, the people want to live near their links, where their families are, where the collective living style of living is. So I think there is a huge challenge to return to a new way of living that is collective. It's not just one house, one family in the periphery. It's now we have to return to a collective style of living.
Thanks, Christian. I don't see any other question, and actually this stages. So, no, there are two that are coming. Perfect, thank you. I was about to introduce the final debate, but let's take these two more questions. It's actually very nice. Two questions from Dina. First, how do you negotiate the relations with the state throughout the co-housing production process? And the second one is a pretty different field, so I will let you answer this one before reading it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. Well, it's a really interesting question as well. What we do, we integrate the state from the beginning. That's why we developed this roundtable. They are part of the whole process, and so they are part of the laboratory, as you say. So when the construction process are beginning, the state already know what is happening, and they are part of the process as well. And we promote as well that the state work together, the neighbors, work together with the academy, and design all together the project. So I think the most important thing is we try to do it collectively with all the different partners and actors and stakeholders involved, because if not, it's not going to be possible. And in relation with the second question, how is a disaster risk reduction addressed within the overcrowded space? It's a huge challenge, because as you saw in the images, it's overcrowded. It's a real informal settlements, not just only the earthquakes, as well. A huge problem that we have in the informal settlements at least in Latin America is, for example, the fire risk, because it's just, I don't know, there are houses built by wood or whatever. So I think there are several challenges now, but at the same time, you know that now where those informal settlements are located is it's a good place to stay, and that's why people are not moving from to the peripheries. So we are facing that, and there's an interesting thing that has been a shift now, and that's why I share with you the study that we did in 2012. Now we have a estatal program that promotes the social condominiums in the place where the people are living. So it has been a process, it's very difficult, and it's a very slow process that we have to carry on, but I think we're moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Thanks both to the audience that is asking questions and to our speakers for responding very carefully and with plenty of detail. We appreciate. We have about a little less than half an hour to have a debate, all of us. I wanted first to share a couple of reflection, a sort of comment to what we saw from your presentations that were all very inspiring. I think that, and perhaps this comment on mine can serve a bit as possible stimulus for some further comments from both our speakers and the audience. Linking to this second last question that was asked, I was wondering actually what the role of political institutions. In this case, it was asked about the state, but then in the case of perhaps Laura or even more, perhaps Melissa, sometimes we can ask the same question regarding to the role of the mayor, which role the mayor can have in such processes, where the political will stands toward or against sometimes the process of housing reclamation by activists, for instance. I'm thinking, for instance, of the mayor of Barcelona that has been quite a key player in such processes. And I guess that is something that is important to talk about. It's something that I notice often with our students. There is sometimes a sort of tendency to take the presence of the state in a sort of confrontational way, which is fairly normal and totally understandable, though at the same time, Christian reminds us that the state is part of the reactor mapping somehow, and it's part of the process from the very beginning. Actually, with Christian, we had an experience in Cambodia a long time ago, and the year that Christian was a student was the only year in which we were able to have a key part of the workshop in Cambodia, the Ministry of Land Management, Urban Planning and Construction, that was in charge of the housing policy, of the national housing policy. And somehow the workshop was meant also to influence the housing policy itself. But then it's not very easy because of constraints, because of also political rhetoric that basically is entrapped within those neoliberal mechanisms that Melissa and Laura were telling us about. Another point that I think is very relevant that emerged really at the outset of the talk from Melissa was the one of housing and the possibilities that are that might emerge from moments of crisis. So Melissa said that when there is an economic growth, it's even harder to produce affordable housing because it's so convenient not to produce it to a certain extent. Apologies in case I'm misquoting or I'm simplifying too much, Melissa, but more or less, I guess we are there. So I guess this role of the economic crisis and also of the abandonment of some of the housing stock or some of the built stock plays a very important role. At the same time, this abandonment, the obsolescence of this part of the urban fabric is somehow the very manifestation of the economic crisis itself, of that political economy that somehow drives these processes. So I guess it's something to be reflected upon. It's a symptom of the crisis, but at some point might liberate space for new possibilities. Lastly, I had two more, but perhaps we can leave it here. Perhaps I can try to merge them together. Laura mentioned housing as a means to an end, as a place where to be happy and healthy. And obviously, at some point during the talk, one person from the audience remarked that at the moment, obviously, housing itself has become a place where many, many things happen. So I guess the very notion of happiness and health are changing in the times, in the last few months that we've been living, and definitely it's something that poses new challenges to the design of the housing product and the possible linking to the very last point I had, the possible way of fostering a participatory process to lead toward that production. Sometimes the participatory process that might lead toward that health and happiness in a collective way or in a collective form of life, to quote what most of you from the audience studied in part of term one, is a very complex one, sometimes because somehow you are not able to get in touch with the end users, as Laura was telling us. Christian reminds us perhaps that we shouldn't even call them end users to a certain extent, because they are very producers of space by themselves. But nevertheless, we are facing challenges. Not all of us are able to get in touch with these people. Not all the inhabitants of the housing itself are able to dedicate time to these processes and so on and so forth. I spoke for long, but I guess somehow these three big points that I mentioned can serve as a sort of opening for the discussion that we'd like to have at the moment. Perhaps there is, we might collect a reaction from Christian, Melissa, or Laura, and then we keep welcoming questions from the students. Open mic, very welcome, or through the chat. Anybody from you, guys?
I'd be happy to start if it's okay with Laura and Christian. Thanks everyone. I really enjoyed the other presentations as well. And thank you for the questions, and also Giorgio for those questions now. In terms of the role of political institutions in the state, you raised this very important point that's interesting to talk about, that's very controversial within the housing movement. So some of you may know the mayor of Barcelona now, Ada Colau. She was one of the founders of the PA, the Plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca, which is the biggest housing movement in the country. That's been around 10 years, and it has 250 nodes all over the country. So it was born in Barcelona, but it's had a huge impact in Spain and also internationally. So she's one of the founders of this movement, and she became mayor of Barcelona in 2014, 2015. And this was interesting because I joined the movement in 2013 doing my PhD research and was in assemblies with her, and then went through this whole process of them forming a political platform, running for mayor. So it was people from the housing movement and different kind of social movement circles, intellectual circles that won the government. That they have a minority government, so they don't have majority to be able to do a lot of things they want to do. But one of the goals is to address the housing crisis. This is a big issue for them. And they're doing some things that are really successful, that have been making a difference, although controversially. So they've created a unit against residential exclusion, which basically when there's evictions, they negotiate with the landowner and with the courts to stop evictions. And they make sure that social services are there and that there's new housing provision. Well, they try to, there's not enough social housing for people that are evicted. There's 8 evictions each day in Barcelona, more or less. So it's still a big issue. And again, this is one of the contradictions and controversies, is that they said we're going to change everything, but there's still evictions happening, even with COVID, which shouldn't be happening, but it does. Also, they've done things like they're trying to find banks who have empty housing. They've done a few expropriations of buildings owned by financial entities to increase the social housing stock. But this is also controversial because they've used about 45 million euros in public taxpayer funds to pay these financial entities, which bought the buildings for next to nothing. And so this is like some of the things that are where social movements say they should just expropriate it and not pay. You know, it's the state could do this as like a radical action. So this is one controversial point. They've been addressing Airbnb, which now with the COVID crisis, with COVID pandemic is not an issue, but it was a huge problem in Barcelona, with a lot of flats going to Airbnb, like over 20,000, and a lot of them without licenses and without permission. So they're trying to regulate and crack down on Airbnb. And the one thing I think connects to the last question about happiness and health and housing as a means to the importance of this is the new initiative they're taking to try to develop a new housing model around cooperative. So instead of the traditional model in Spain is vivienda de protección oficial, officially protected housing, which comes from the Franco dictatorship. And it's housing that's subsidized by the state. And then people who live there pay a mortgage. And so they become homeowners, but they're not allowed to sell the apartment for 20 years. So it's kind of, but then after the 20 years, they could sell it and probably, depending where the housing is located, make a big profit. The issue that Laura mentioned about the density of the city is, I mean, Barcelona is one of the densest cities in Europe. And the housing, the land that the city owns they own a very small amount of land. So a lot of this land is in the periphery of the city. So it's kind of reinforcing the peripheralization of social housing, which is really problematic. But one thing I want to say about this new cooperative model that's, I think, interesting to think about is there's a lot of problems around financing because it's a new model. And so none of the banks want to finance it. So the idea is that the cooperative takes out the mortgage from the bank, and they work with developers to develop the housing. But because there's not one person who's responsible for the debt, the banks they're very hesitant to lend. It's also not necessarily affordable. And I think connected to this question of engagement and how people participate, I was involved in because the city basically has land available. They put competition out. They say, okay, we have these 8 pieces of land. You can present a project to build with a collective, and it has to have some social purpose. So shared spaces and also with the community, this sort of thing. It's a lot of time. So it's a certain type of profile of people who have time to participate and can be part of this. And it's, again, as I said, it's not necessarily affordable because you have to put a down payment, which some people don't have access to. I will share the link of a really amazing project called La Borda, which is become very well known internationally, which is a cooperative housing project that has a lot of collective spaces. They have flexible flats. So if you have a child and you need a bigger space, you can expand it. And they developed this over 3 years of assemblies with like incredible time commitment. And they finally built this building, and they worked with a Coop 57, with a cooperative financer to get money. They fundraised, they did all sorts of things to make this project work. And they did it, and it's an incredible project. I'll share the link, you can look at it. I think you'll be very interested. But this to say that I think this, to connect to the third question before I'm going to quickly close, that this is a big issue. And I think these cooperative projects is who can participate, who has the ability to, who has the time, that sort of thing. Just comment quickly on the second question, the role of crisis. I mean, I think this is a big, it's huge. I think there is a lot of possibility for transformation in times of crisis, but at the same time, in the Spanish context, the state really used this moment of crisis because in Spain, growth is based on construction and tourism. Those are the axes of growth. And this is from the Franco dictatorship, which was almost 40 years until 1979. 1940 to 1979. And this was actively created by the dictatorship, building the construction sector, building the tourism sector, which are global actors, these big companies. So the state, during the crisis, what they actively did was say, okay, we're going to change legal laws around renting, around tenants, around the bad bank, which was a financial tool to get empty bank-owned properties. And we're going to let real estate investment trusts, so companies come in and buy properties that pay no taxes. So basically what they've done is created the conditions for a new real estate boom. And that's what's been happening. Blackstone has come in, all these new private equity firms. So I don't know, it's really difficult because in the moment of crisis, it's important for grassroots mobilization to also address this, but also the state, especially in the Spanish case, sees it as an opportunity to create new conditions for a new cycle of growth. So I'll leave it there and pass the floor to Laura. I'll send the link to La Borda in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. If Christian and Laura want to pick up on that, and again, I reiterate it, we welcome comments also from the rest of the audience. Don't be shy.
No, I would like to share 2 main reflections very briefly. That I think that maybe, well, that families are constantly building their environment on a daily basis, not just the housing, they are constantly building it. So I think one of the challenges is to understand this as a part of the whole process. And as Laura said, to foster the good living and the happiness for families. Like I think it's necessary to understand it as a part of the process. And the second thing is that from an individualistic model which promotes one house is for one family, that also the family here is understood as a father, a mother, and 2.5 children. So it's a typical family, it's an abstract of family. We have to push and we have to work hard to move to a new paradigm, to a collective way of living where the families are not typical, where the families are different, that they are monoparental, there are extended families there. So we have to move not to a typical and a model housing project. So we have to diversify that. and we have to push harder to move to a collective style of living. And that's why I think that the case of Spain is very interesting, how they are moving, or not moving, but they are all the process of cooperatives, and it's not a new way, but I think to going back again to the collective way of living is a clue. And I think maybe COVID has made this very clear, because we need and we want to live close our networks with we want to connect with our neighbors, our families close to us. So I think there is a huge challenge as well, but I think, well, we have to move there.
Thanks, Christian. Laura, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention something about just like this moment of crisis when you're speaking. It just sort of occurred to me that, and sort of feeding back into the role of the state in all of these discussions, but also like the actual production of housing, because they're like an integral member, one, because they have money, and two, because they're able to sort of dictate priorities. In the United States, the biggest funder of money, the biggest funder of affordable housing is the IRS, because it's through tax credits. So it covers all states, but the IRS provides more housing than the Department of Housing and Urban Development, like by far. And so there's such a big part of the discussion. And, when we are creating housing, if you have an idea of something or thought of something, you're with the state from the very beginning. And right now the state is in a position where it has no money. I mean, the election was a huge, basically we were in affordable housing in New York. We're like at this crossroads where you'd be on phone calls where you would say, is this program going to continue, or is there going to be funding for this? Is there going to be any sort of supportive housing? And then the answer would literally be like, well, it depends if Trump or Biden wins. And then that will determine if there's going to be affordable housing, or supportive housing rather. And, it's so important to the actual production. And so I feel right now that there's something that's going to be very interesting for what happens in the next year, because in New York, you have, there's such a constraint on space in how people live. And there's sort of been this push towards smaller and smaller and smaller spaces. The guidelines for the regulations for like the minimum space for a studio apartment in affordable housing is like 320 square feet. And they're becoming smaller and smaller. And so if people have like over these last, I don't even know how many months it's been, 11 months since we've, and here we were in like a pretty, I didn't leave my gate for 2.5 months. Like it was very much a lockdown. I mean, people left, like people were gone. And so in a lot of neighborhoods that there wasn't a sort of a big change in the number of people who were there, but in more affluent neighborhoods, like units are empty. I mean, it's like people just fled the city. And so if you look at different maps, they track things by like garbage pickup and different indicators to try to see who is living in spaces. And there's parts of Manhattan where there's just like a tremendous amount of empty spaces. And I think that it's going to be a question of like what the state, what the local, in New York, you have the city and the state, which is sort of unusual, but both sort of equal in its influence, about what they're going to do about all of those empty spaces. Like, do you try to do something that is, very different, and you try to figure out ways to, I don't know, repurpose them? Like it's already happening a little bit. Like it's happening right now with hotels. So like my organization has, been contacted by a few hotels to take over hotels for social housing or for shelters, because there's not the market for it anymore. And so now, like even in affluent areas, like in the Upper West Side, which is in Manhattan, you have hotels that have been taken over and now have homeless people. Like, is that going to go back? Are they going to kick those people out? You know, what, it's sort of this determination of how what do we want our city to look like? And sort of where do we go? Like, it's sort of an opportunity, but you also don't have that much money. So it's sort of like this, it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Thanks, Laura. Wonderful. There are a couple of questions that are connected, so I'll try to summarize a bit, and then any of you can respond or react. One is on the eternal conundrum between housing or property, owning a house or renting a house. There is an example from China, from Wei, that tells us that very often a rich and middle-class family owns more than 2 houses, while the poor have to rent houses. And I was wondering whether we have a similar, we might experience a similar condition in the case of Melissa in Europe, or South and North America in the case respectively of Christian and Laura. I don't think that personally rental housing, being in the position of renting a house should be seen as negative, though sometimes, of course, the rental market is very much driven and affected by big landlords, let's say. So that's something that is to be taken into account. Connected to that, there was another question from Yuyan that was on the oscillation of housing prices, how they might change when the affordable or social housing is built next to that. And whether that can be a successful strategy, for instance, to keep the housing prices down, which is also something a little sad and tricky to say. We live in a context, at the moment I'm not there, but we live, many of us, in London, where very often new developments are marketed advertising the fact that there is no affordable housing within them. Because affordable housing sometimes, even if the affordable housing in London is not affordable for any poor family or let's say lower middle class family, there is still the stigma on affordable housing being against the housing that will be rented by big families, noisy families, etc. Families that, you know, the upper middle class that might want to invest into these new developments won't like to live next to, which is terrible, but still was part of a marketing campaign that was ended up on the newspapers a couple of years ago. So I was wondering whether our guests have any response to these 2 inputs that were very nice.
I have a very quick response to the question by Wei Zhu, and also to the final question by Yue Wan. In terms of the first one about the wealthy owning multiple properties and often poor people with renting, I mean, I think this is a similar story all over the world. In Montreal, which is a city I lived in for many years, the city has a program called Accès Condo, which some municipalities have this kind of program where they offer support to people who don't own properties to be able to buy. I mean, this is problematic on many levels, but these kind of programs do exist in cities because, I mean, I say it's problematic because I don't necessarily think becoming a homeowner is the solution. This is the problem, is that the society we live in, to have a secure, safe home, you need to own it. But I wanted to raise the example of Denmark, which I think is quite interesting, where, because for example, what happens in Spain is that a lot of people have second homes as a way to invest and save money. And this is again from the time of dictatorship, when homeownership was very much instilled by the dictatorship as a way to become a good Spaniard, as a way of modernity, as a way of all these things of becoming developed, and as a way of racial hygiene too, as like a way of becoming Spanish. So in Barcelona, for example, 1.5% of the housing is social housing, but 11% of the housing stock is empty. So this is empty housing owned by people who have second homes. And a former minister of housing in Catalonia they passed a law where they were trying in 2007. There was a coalition tripartite left government in Catalonia, and they tried to pass a law where they would force people who had second homes to rent them, who left them empty, to rent them. And she said, we use examples like Denmark, where this is normal. This is part of the social dynamic, is that you don't leave a property empty, is that you should have property where people use them. And she said that because of the Catalan bourgeois and because of the power of that sector, that part of the law got completely destroyed. So they've never even been able to address this issue. So I think it's a very challenging question. Like, how do we deal with the fact that wealthy people hoard housing? And then, you know, maybe I'm gonna leave it there just because I wanna give time. I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give this, I'm gonna put a link that I think could be interesting to address the second question. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Any reaction from either Christian or Laura?
Yeah, I have a comment in relation with the question related with the incrementality that made Dina. That I think that the design need to allow the space for adaptation and adjustment. But I think it's not necessary. But I believe that the process to reaching the final houses must to be participatory enough, not just as a kind of checklist to do. I think it's necessary to incorporate families from the beginning to reach a good design process at the end. So I think that it is necessary to incorporate in the whole process the richness of life and the diversity of families and what I was saying before, that the family is not only one type of families. The families are diverse, are different, and there is the richness. So I think the challenge is how to incorporate it, and at the same time, how you can promote the mobility. So because the house is not, you're not gonna live in the same house for the whole life. So how the housing process as well can recognize that and can promote that. Maybe if you are an elder person, you can live in a different house, and then if you're a young couple, you can live in a different house. So I think we have to move and how to incorporate those processes. I say that's kind of the richness of life. At the end is from the, I believe in a participatory process and a really horizontal process.
Thanks, Christian. Laura.
I mean, I don't think that I have that much more to add to what was just said. I think that like this opportunity that right now is just this opportunity to sort of for a reevaluation of how we do like housing in our cities. And I think sometimes when there's like these booms that, you know, Melissa was talking about, there's just like production. And like this last year, I think if on like a small scale of personal scale plus for us as a larger, for a city, that there's been sort of a reevaluation of where we are and how we got here and what is next, and sort of a calm of sometimes, for some people I think have been very busy and some people have not been as busy, but I just think that it's like a point to reflect on where we are and to sort of see how it goes and see how our city is changing, because it's like it changed like that, like in 2 months, hundreds of thousands of people left the city, and so you have a point where I think we just see where we go, and sort of the time and energy to be able to, like, if you change how sort of participation of communities versus just like build, like it seems like this would be the time to be able to do it.
Thanks, Laura. I'm asking also the other bad stuff. Do we have time for one last question? Can I give it? I noticed one question from Alejandra. Can we give it 2 more minutes, perhaps?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for.
You can use the open mic if Alejandra wants to just say it.
Thanks for confirming. Actually, Alejandra, do you mind asking this question yourself?
Sure. I'm just going to read it really quick. So considering the rise of the city and the strong migration for socioeconomic reasons to the urban context, where many times these settlements have been carried out on high prone risk areas, given its strategic location towards sources of work, how could we respond to this reality without compromising the already established social networks and current sources of work?
Any reaction to this? It's also in the chat in case, or I can reread it if you want for you.
Just very quickly, I mean, in the case of Barcelona, the center of the city is not, I wouldn't say it's high risk prone area, and it's very densified and consolidated over such a long period of time. But I think what's important, this point that you make about people already having their social networks, their lives established. So a lot of the housing movements, there's a big tenants union now called the Sindicat de Llogateres, the tenants union in Barcelona. They have campaigns that are, we stay. It's like a hashtag, ens quedem, nos quedamos. And so the part of the campaigning is saying, okay, well, if we can't pay our rent or whatever, we need to stay in our neighborhood. So I guess the response is struggling, like organizing collectively and saying, no, we need to stay where we, I mean, I think the question that you have about risk is a different scenario, but I wanted to raise that as the way people deal with this kind of reality of being connected to a place and having your social networks, your children go to school, all this sort of thing.
Thanks, Melissa. I think we should bring it to a close. I would like to take the opportunity perhaps to leave in case they wanted to share one final thought to Christian, Laura, or any other members of the staff that hasn't talked to us yet today, if you want. Christian, Laura, any final reflection, any final comment?
Not a reflection, but so much as just saying I really appreciate, hearing about what's happening in other cities and some of the issues that are going on. New York is such an insular place, and people in New York think that it's like the only place in the world, and that our problems and greatness is only in New York. And so it's sort of like, to me, it feels like a good challenge to see like how you readdress it, and sort of looking outward for like the opportunities and ideas and inspiration to do that. So just say thank you.
Christian?
Just a very specific reflection that at the end, and the interesting thing, listening Laura and Melissa, and also with the discussion that we're facing a global housing problem, and it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. So I think the first thing that for us has been a huge learning, that is the same situation that Melissa said with Nueva York. We in Santiago, we believe that everything happened just in Santiago. It's not like that. Like it's a Latin American process. The thing, that's why I was commenting you, like the site and service program, it wasn't just in Chile. It was all around Latin America. It was all around the globe. So I think there is a huge challenge to understand it as a global challenge, like the housing problem. But at the same time, I think that the most difficult thing is we have to understand and we have to incorporate the differences and the richness of each context. And this thing applies to every scale, to the housing scale, to the urban scale, and the different scales. So I think there is a two-phase challenge that is a global one, but at the same time there have local issues that have to be incorporated in the whole process.
Thanks, everybody. I'll bring to a close, and then I will leave the final word to Catalina for concluding the Urban Design Conversation series. I wanted to thank you and all the people that contributed to the discussion and everybody that was attending today. Just one final word from me. One comment from Christian, and then immediately next to it, after it, one comment from Catalina in the chat that was commenting of how housing sometimes is produced following sometimes very heteronormative assumptions. Christian mentioned that very often the household is conceived as a household composed by one father, one mother, and a series of children. Last year I concluded, and I was able to find it while you were talking, I concluded that the urban design module that I teach with a quote from Zaida Mushi Martinez, which, if I'm not wrong, is from Barcelona herself too. And roughly translating from Spanish, she says that industrialization has brought with it the separation of factory versus house, and the specification of who lives in that house. A family formed by a father, a mother, and 2 or 3 children. A person who earns the salary, a caring person, and the people cared for. This family was not always as such, nor is it like that now. Nevertheless, the house is designed for such family and reinforces a hierarchy starting from its interior spaces. So I guess that today, with your contribution, this discussion was really fundamental for us to move away from such heteronormative assumptions. Again, a house can mean many things, and obviously housing as a verb within Turner, but many people after Turner obviously too, is not only limited to the enclosed perimeter of one single housing unit. Your contributions in terms of understanding the complexity of the housing projects and process was really welcome today, and I hope that students will treasure it in the upcoming months, and also in their overall process of rethinking their professional pathways. Thanks also for sharing a lot of resources in the chat that I invite students to. Unfortunately, we cannot copy paste, so please take screenshot or click on the links before they disappear. And now I leave the word to Catalina for concluding the series. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm very happy today. We are kind of concluding the first series of urban design conversations. We hope to keep expanding and inviting not only our alumni that are very central to how we think and understand how we are cultivating a different community of practice, and also to expose the different trajectories of our students. So very enriching and inspiring experiences that we've been hearing throughout the 3 sessions. So we have to keep in touch with you and inviting some other inspiring alumni that we have all around the world. If anything, one of the good things about this pandemic is that allow us to reach people across the globe easily. So if that's one of the only advantages, at least we should take it further. So I'm very happy you were all involved, and we're going to make available the videos of these conversations. So hopefully we can kick off a longer engagement through it. So thanks a lot, and hopefully we see you soon, and happy Lunar New Year. Take care.